Thank you all for coming. I want to begin by just thanking first the First Congregational Church and Reverend Paul for offering us the space of the church to have this event this evening. I also want to offer thanks to all the volunteers from Voices Rising Together who contributed to pulling this event together. As any of you who do community work know, there are just a lot of details behind the scene, even in having an evening presentation. And folks have been working at it for quite a number of weeks, and they are collective gratitude to all of them. Before they introduce Dr. Rucinski, I want to say just a few words about the spirit in which this event came about. And it really has to do with the fact that Voices Rising Together is a local grassroots group that started just a 3 months ago, based in Granville, with members from Southwick and Westfield and Granville, of course, and some other towns in the area. The part of the core intention as we formed this group, the collective intention, was to offer the community the public educational opportunities around key issues that often generate quite a bit of partisan stress. And to do it in a non-partisan way that was educational, that would invite people from both sides of the political spectrum to come and hear factually based information that they can use however they choose to address a key issue of our time. And the two issues that we chose first, as a group, were climate change, finding ways to educate ourselves and the public around climate change issues, and secondly, social justice issues. So tonight is our first, the public educational endeavor. We hope to have others as we move through the summer and into the fall, some perhaps on climate change, some on social justice issues, and beyond that, we'll see what the group collectively decides to address. Dr. Rucinski received his doctorate in physics from the University of Rochester. He's worked for 30 years in the high-tech industry. He currently is a manager of a software project at MIT at Lincoln Laboratory in Lexington, Massachusetts. And since 2010, he's been working with Citizens Climate Lobby as a volunteer and now as the Mass coordinator, state coordinator for CCL, to find a way to put a firm and predictable price on carbon dioxide, which, as all or most of us know, is the predominant man-made gas that contributes to climate change and ocean acidification. And with no further ado, Dr. Rucinski, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, John. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate seeing such a big group on a Saturday night. It's really a wonderful thing for me to be able to get out of Boston and come out to the western part of the state. I keep telling John that I've been out riding. I've probably ridden past your house on my bike because my wife and I love to come out this way and go bike riding. And I met somebody earlier from Shelburne Falls, and we ride up around there as well. So it's really a pleasure for me to be out here tonight. So the thing I want to talk about tonight, and I think it fits very well with the nonpartisan spirit that John was mentioning, is this debate that we're having in our country. And if you look at the news, if you hear any programs on climate change, there always seem to be sort of two sides to the debate. One is well, we don't know all the facts, and we don't know whether climate change is really going to be that harmful to us or not. We can't quantify it or measure it or predict it accurately. And not only that, but even if we did anything about it, it would destroy the economy. And then you have people on the other side of the spectrum who say, we actually have to redo capitalism in order to fix climate change. And I don't subscribe to either of those views. I come down in the middle. I think that actually capitalism is one of the key ingredients that we could use to help us address climate change. And I also don't believe that addressing the challenges that face us need to harm our economy if we can only get the rules of the economy right. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight, is what is kind of the middle approach to addressing climate change in a meaningful way. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about how I got involved in this. And that is that, as John mentioned, I do have a degree in physics. And so my ability to understand climate science and to empathize or identify with climate scientists and the work that they do and how their work proceeds was kind of second nature to me. And in 1999, a friend of mine mentioned to me this phrase, global warming, and I didn't know what that was, and I started reading about it. And over the course of the next decade, one book after another, I became increasingly concerned about climate change. And I always say, fortunately, in 2009, I lost my job. I got laid off from a job that I was doing as a project manager. And my wife was panicked. Our first child was about to go off to college. And, but I was happy as a lark. I walked out of that place with a big smile on my face. And the reason was because I thought, I can now go off and do something about my concern about climate change. I'll find a job in the clean energy sector, and I'll be able to marry my passion about doing something for the climate to my need to earn a livelihood, and I'll just be happy as a clam. And so for the next 6 months, I started going to seminars and networking events and conferences, and as many of you know, in and around Boston, there's a fairly thriving clean energy industry. But 6 months later, I wasn't any closer to a job than I was at the beginning. And so when I went to these networking events, I started asking people, and these were regulators and entrepreneurs and investors, why isn't this market taking off to the extent that it's able to offer somebody with about 25 years in software project management an opportunity to earn some money? And they all came back and said the same thing. They said, clean energy will not take off until there is a price on carbon. And that was a little bit of an obscure phrase to me at the time, but certainly seemed to make a little bit of sense that maybe you needed to get the economics right before you could actually have a thriving clean energy economy or a clean energy revolution happening in the free market. I kept looking for a job. I also, that following summer, happened to read a book by James Hansen, who to me is the world's premier climate scientist, really pushing the envelope on our understanding of climate. And I read his book, and I went to his website, and on his website I found a link to an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, and when I looked them up, what were they doing but working to put a price on carbon? So I had sort of come full circle. Even if I wasn't going to get a job in clean energy, maybe I could at least do something that would help other people get jobs in clean energy and help us reduce our emissions. So what I want to talk about are really 4 different sections. One is our current understanding of the climate threat, the free market and controlling pollution in free markets and how we've traditionally done that and what we face right now in the free market, a proposed free market climate change solution, and then finally implementing that climate solution, because as we all know, if we're going to solve these problems, we're probably going to need government intervention, and how do you motivate the government to move and act in the way that we need? So to start off with, and by the way, as I go through each of these sections, I'll pause for questions after each section, so we don't have to hold our questions till the end. But I'd just like to kind of go through, if you have a really pressing need or there's something you don't understand, feel free to raise your hand. But otherwise, I will pause and take some questions. I do this work in part because I have 3 children. They're all in their early 20s right now. They're, you know, I'm a proud father. They're amazingly talented, they're very intelligent, and they've been well prepared in terms of education for really thriving in the world. And when I see what they're doing today, I think my wife and I really did a good job. But when I think a little bit more about that and what my kids are going to face in the coming decades, a definite cloud comes over me. Because as a scientist, again, I understand the science, I understand what a climate model is, I know what it is to collect data and make predictions about future scientifically based events. And we are looking at some pretty dire predictions. And just to give one example of this, one of the things that really pops into my mind as being very tangible and easy to imagine and think about and have some empathy about is the concept of sea level rise. So sea level rise has already been happening. I think mean sea level rise or average sea level rise around the world increased by about a foot over the course of the 20th century. And the rate of sea level rise is increasing as we speak. Sea level rise happens for 2 reasons. One is that when greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere and the atmosphere warms, a lot of that heat gets transferred to the oceans. And as we know, when you heat water, it expands. You might not think that the difference between 58 degrees and 68 degrees might mean a lot of expansion, but when you talk about the amount of water in the ocean, it does. So a lot of the sea level rise we've been experiencing has been because of this thermal expansion that happens. But we're also experiencing it because really Greenland and Antarctica are melting. And there's kind of an interesting story. A professor at UMass Amherst, in collaboration with some other professors in Pennsylvania, were very puzzled by a historical result that they couldn't understand. And that is that if you look in the historical record, you will see sea level rise and fall based on the amount of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas. You see sea level rise and fall based on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And they tried to develop computer models that looked at how much the atmosphere would warm, how much the oceans would warm, how much thermal expansion would be, how much glacial melt there would be. And they couldn't get the sea level right. They couldn't develop a model that replicated the historical sea level that they observed if you go off and do geological studies and drill down the cores and things like that. And what finally hit them was that they were forgetting a very basic part of the physics that was going on when the great ice sheets melt. And that was that right now there are these ice shelves that go out over the ocean at the edges of Antarctica and Greenland. And when those ice sheets melt, there's a lot of ice on the continent itself that is being held back from being able to flow out to the oceans. And the piece of physics that they didn't have right in their models was that when those ice shelves melted, they left these very high cliffs of ice. And those ice cliffs basically collapse under their own weight. You can only get so high with a glacier before it's simply going to collapse from a structural deficiency. And when they put that additional piece of physics into the model, then they got agreement between what the model said and what the historical record said. So this is very good news. You can hear the champagne corks popping, and everybody's really happy about this. Except that when you run those models and you look at the amount of CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere today, and you run those models out over the next 100 years, what you find is that previously, with the bad physics, we were predicting about 3 feet of sea level rise over the course of the century. But when you put the new physics in, you get 6 feet of sea level rise. And then not only that, but if you look a little bit further into the structure of the continents and exactly how those glaciers are melting, what you find out is there's actually significant probabilities, by which I mean 10%, 20%, 30% probability, that we will see much worse sea level rise than 6 feet or 3 feet. And the worst part of the story is this is not necessarily going to be a gradual rise. We're not going to see whatever it is, a centimeter a year or 2 centimeters a year. We could go through a decade where significant parts of Greenland or Iceland are falling into the ocean, and you could see multiple feet within the space of a decade. So the news is not that good, and there are a lot of questions that we have about climate science. But right now there are really more questions than we have definitive answers to. So again, we're not going to be able to predict exactly what the sea level rise will be over the course of this century. We're not going to be able to say, oh, you know what, between 2050 and 2060, we're going to see 2 feet of sea level rise, just because of the structure of Antarctica and exactly how it's going to fall into the ocean in that period. But it seems like for all of the questions that we have, as scientists go about answering those questions, the answers come back worse and worse and worse. There's very little upside to the answers that science is coming back with. And again, just to kind of emphasize that, when I was talking about mean sea level rise, just like in investing, results will vary. And so one of the things that I find fun to think about, even though again it's very depressing, is that Greenland and Antarctica, because there's so much mass there, as a physicist, this is fun. Those masses exert gravitational pull on the objects around them. And principally, the most meaningful one for us is the water in the ocean. So just like the moon creates tides, the mass of Greenland and the mass of Antarctica is pulling the oceans closer to those continents than it would otherwise be if that mass wasn't there. Which means that when those ice sheets begin to melt, and when they melt, there's going to be this relaxation of ocean. And that extra water that's now moving away from those continents is going to go to the far away places where the water is being pulled from. So Boston happens to be one of those places. And if you look at this map that these guys put together, it shows the United States. And actually it shows, where are you going to see even accentuated sea level rise? And it happens to be along the western, kind of the southwestern part of California and Boston. And when he shows this to his European colleagues, they call that the karma effect, because the Earth is kind of giving us a double whammy because we're ignoring the problem right now. So actually in Boston, even though we might, again, the mean sea level rise might be 6 feet by the end of the century, if we're lucky to hold to that. In Boston, it will be 30% higher than that. And so even at 6 feet, they're predicting that Boston, 30% of Boston would be underwater with 6 feet of sea level rise. So this is partly why I do the volunteer work that I do, why I'm so interested in acting on climate. And that's the section on climate change. So does anybody have any questions about climate change?
So this shelf that we're seeing in the pictures that's coming off of Antarctica, it's winter down there now.
Yes.
And it's going to break away momentarily, and it's 11 miles or something worth of ice. It doesn't really, other than the thing breaking away, when it has to get away from the fissure that it's created for that to begin to sink. Am I right about that? I mean, it has to be distanced a little bit.
Well, the ice shelf, once it breaks off, then whatever...
It floats.
It's floating, so there you're not going to see a big change in sea level.
So when that thing
But
does
what's
break.
behind it
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
is now
about. 'cause I
not,
didn't
it's like
realize
a dam,
that-
it's acting as a dam.
Right.
And when it's gone, what's behind it is
So
going
what's
to
the,
flow.
what's the speed like of the stuff that remains collapsing on itself? What's that kind of timing like?
I don't really know that time scale.
Mhm.
It's,
I know it's geologic, but really.
it used to be what we think of as geologic,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't
a
say that
different
anymore.
geology. Yeah.
Again, as they learn more about this and as they discover, this stuff is so fascinating, as they
It is.
discover the shape of the actual continent that's below all that ice.
Yeah.
Even the shape of the
Yeah.
continent has an effect on how fast things are. And we, of course, don't have that profile. We don't know the full details of what the ground looks like, how much of it is above sea level, how much of it is below sea level. And that's one of the things they're worried about, that there's actually kind of a rise up to the edge of Antarctica, but then there are places where it falls off again into the interior. And once the ice comes in and the warm water is seeping in from underneath and melting underneath, and it gets over that edge, then you're going to have an acceleration to the melting again. So
So there may be an event that helps the figures be a little bit more accurate, or a little bit more well-known.
if we can continue making measurements and understand it better, again, we can.
Is there any kind of similar thing happening in Greenland, like a large amount that you
Greenland's-
can actually see?
Are there particular ice shelves?
Yeah, that's what
I haven't heard a lot about that. It seems like everything I hear about Greenland is more the surface melt that they're seeing and ice tunneling down, water tunneling down, and then again, attacking it from below in a sense. Any other questions about climate change?
Is this irreversible?
Is it irreversible? There are elements of it that nothing's irreversible. The Earth has gone through ice ages and warming periods before, when large amounts of Greenland and Antarctica have been water. But if we could restore the greenhouse gas balance, so if we could get back to pre-industrial levels of CO2, which I'll throw out this number because I'll use it later, 270 parts per million. So 270 carbon dioxide molecules for every million particles in the atmosphere. If we could get back to that level, then you would at least see a slowing. But some of the melting that's happening, again, is due to the warmer oceans that we now have. And that returning the oceans to the temperature that they were at before this all started, that's going to take a long time. So we've got a lot of melting in the pipeline no matter what we do. It's almost, maybe if we could take it back to 200 parts per million or 170 parts per million, we might get the atmosphere down cold enough that we could even inhibit a lot of the melting, but that's not something that I know a lot about. I did find a paper where a climate scientist took a model, one of the climate models, and he ran it with decreasing carbon dioxide, with carbon dioxide decreasing at the same rate as we've increased it since we started burning fossil fuels. And what he found was that a lot of the conditions that we see do get reversed. But again, I don't think we can say these large-scale changes that we're seeing on Greenland and Antarctica may take even further cooling before we can restore what we had before. Okay? I want to. Okay.
If Boston, if this means Boston could be a third underwater, what does it mean for the islands and things like that, the island nations and those kinds of things?
Right, well, there are a lot of island nations who are buying land in New Zealand right now so that they have some place to move their people to. They're actually critical defense resources. Obviously, every Navy base is at sea level, and so that's a big concern for the Pentagon. So yes, 6 feet in Boston is one thing, but if you're at sea level, then you're going to be experiencing, high tide. Even in Florida today, they're experiencing what they call sunny day flooding, which is just high tide, and it's flooding the streets.
But if the Pentagon is making plans for this already, while the government is denying the existence of it?
The Pentagon doesn't pay very much attention to the politics. They're chartered with providing defense for the nation, and they're going to do it. So you won't find a lot of climate science deniers in the Pentagon. You'll find people who are concentrating on keeping the United States and our allies safe.
When you talk to people who deny climate changes, or climate deniers, what I want to call them, the science of it, nothing's changing, they often use the examples of the cycles with the ice ages and the thaws and stuff. What is a good answer to say to those people when they say, well, that's just part of the whole thing, we've been frozen before, and now we're all,
Scientists. 90-something% of scientists agree that global warming is really caused by burning of fossil fuels.
My answer to that, my latest response to that, I'm a little bit of a, well anyway, maybe we'll get this through the rest of the talk. But the thing, if somebody were to come up to me and say this is just part of a cycle, I would say, which cycle exactly is that? Because I know that there were ice ages. I know that there are solar cycles. I know that there are seasons. But there is no cycle of which this is a part. You can't look in the geological record and see this as a cycle. It doesn't exist. In fact, again, today, if we hadn't loaded up the atmosphere in this way, we'd be sliding into an ice age. One last question.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
If we had not emitted all these greenhouse gases over the last 150 years or so, we would be sliding into an ice age. It would be cooler today than it was 100 years ago.
Instead of warming.
Just one last question.
I have a very good friend. We argue regularly. I usually win. But he brings up every so often what I call bullshit information that I never heard of. So I try to check it out. Recently he's told me that he's read, which I doubt, that volcanoes cause as much carbon emission as man produces. Is there any information on that?
I would say volcanoes are part of the natural cycle.
Right.
Volcanoes happen. We don't have any control over them. Okay. There is a lot more carbon dioxide being put into the atmosphere by about a factor of 10 or so than we are doing with fossil fuels. But the only thing is that all of that other carbon dioxide is part of natural cycles. And there are processes, whether it's vegetation or uptake in the ocean, where that carbon, that amount of carbon, can cycle through the atmosphere safely. It's just that when you increase the emissions level, there are no reservoirs, there are no activities, there are no processes capable of taking in that excess. And that's the problem. We've been afforestation and other land use problems.
Thank you. I have another winning argument.
Okay. So now I want to get on to the free market and free market control of pollution. So in June of 2008, everybody was here in June of 2008? Gasoline went to $4 a gallon. And a lot of people started changing their habits. People got their bikes out and started biking to work. People started walking more. People started carpooling. If there was public transit available, we saw a big upsurge in public transit around that time. I was driving a Prius. It was 3 years old at the time, and I was told that I could sell that car for more than I had bought it for off the lot new, if I wanted to. So from that little unintentional experiment, we found that rising energy prices really do affect consumer behavior and business behavior. And not only did we see consumers changing their habits, but we also saw investors changing their habits. Investors started investing in clean energy startups. And that is another cycle, if you will, that if you look back at investment history, you'll see that when the price of a barrel of oil goes up, investment in clean energy goes up. And when the price of a barrel of oil retreats, investment in clean energy retreats. So this is not a supposition. This is not a theoretical conjecture or a hypothesis. This is what happens in the economy. That when prices go up on anything, investors rush in to find a cheaper alternative because they know they can get a ready market for consumers or businesses who want to hold the line on their budgets. The thing I find interesting about this is that this seems to be a very effective mechanism for getting people and businesses and investors to all act in a way that we need. Invest in clean energy or find alternatives to make use of efficiency or conservation in your own lives just by changing the price of this commodity. So the fact that we ran that experiment, that we've seen it in action for over a number of years, and again we see, you know, today, does anybody know what the price of a gallon of gas is? It's $2.35. You know, car companies are now building more SUVs.
Yeah.
So again, price of gasoline goes up, car companies start changing their production lines. They don't do it because the government's telling them to do it. They don't do it because the government's introducing new regulations or new legislation or anything like that. They do it because they know that that's what consumers are going to be looking for. And so we ought to be able to take advantage of that. But before I say more about that, I want to contrast the situation with fossil fuels to another important energy source that we have, and that is nuclear power. Nuclear power is kind of interesting. When it was first introduced, people used this phrase, too cheap to meter. And what they meant by that was they thought it was going to be really inexpensive to take some radioactive material, use it to heat up water, create steam, run a turbine, and produce electricity. But then the government got into the act, and they said, well, you're not just going to be able to throw that uranium out into the middle of somewhere and put a plant up in the middle of New York City. You've got to worry about the radioactive fallout or any radioactive contamination. And by that time, and at that point in our history, people were really paranoid about radioactivity. Nobody wanted it near their house or where their kids were going to school or anything like that. And so we started regulating the nuclear power industry. And over the course of a couple of decades, basically what we said was, you must build your nuclear power plants in a way that captures all of the pollutants from that plant. And you can't release pollutants from that plant. And we put a very high bar on the amount of protection that you had to put in place in order to avoid contaminating surrounding water tables, water sources, or the air. And economically, what that meant, and economists have a word for this, they call it internalizing. The nuclear power industry had to internalize all of the costs associated with the production of nuclear power. They had to pay for the containment vehicles, they had to pay for any filtration systems, and they had to really crank up on the cost of building a nuclear power plant because of the need to build in all of these safeguards. So what we have today is a nuclear power industry, and I know we could quibble about this, but it's relatively safe. We in the United States haven't had a lot of major nuclear disasters at power plants that have caused a lot of deaths or inflicted a lot of costs on surrounding communities or the nation as a whole. It could have been very different had we not regulated nuclear power. The nuclear power industry would be in the same position as the fossil fuel industry. They could sell their product and they could pollute for free. So imagine a nuclear power industry that wasn't regulated, that could take spent fuel rods, put them on a barge, take them a couple miles off the coast and drop them in the ocean, or leave them in a local landfill. This is kind of the equivalent of what the fossil fuel industry does. They produce their product, but then the users of that product are free to pollute. And by producing that pollution, you can imagine, again, with nuclear power, that pollution out in the environment would have huge social costs. People who might not even be buying electricity from that plant would still be impacted by the social costs of allowing that radiation. And that's what we see with fossil fuels. When fossil fuels get used, the pollution goes out into the atmosphere. And if it were completely benign, if all it was water vapor and oxygen or something, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But where it's a greenhouse gas and it warms the atmosphere, melts the glaciers and whatnot, that imposes social costs, just like radioactivity would impose social costs. So there's this distortion in the market that says if you want to buy nuclear power, you have to pay the full cost of producing nuclear power. But if you want to buy fossil energy, you only have to pay the cost of extraction, but the social costs, you don't have to pay for that. And that makes it unfair in the energy markets between companies who want to produce nuclear power plants and those who want to drill another oil well or gas well, or whatever it might be. And that's a distortion that we really need to get fixed. And that's what those investors and entrepreneurs were telling me when they said, we're not going to have a clean energy revolution until we put a price on carbon. We're not going to have a clean energy revolution until the price of fossil fuel energy reflects all of the costs that are associated with using fossil fuels. But if we could do that, we would get that effect that we saw in 2008 when the price of gas went to $4 a gallon. And people would be changing their habits and investors would be investing in the next clean energy Google or Apple. And we would begin to reduce our emissions. So if we could put that price on carbon and make that price, make fossil energy prices internalize the social costs that are associated with use, then we could get those effects that we want. Just want to look here. Yeah, so next I want to talk about what a solution like that might look like and give you some results that predict the effects of a policy like that. But before I do, I want to ask if there are any questions about these external costs, social costs, and the free market used to control pollution.
I think this is a quick question for the first segment. But does population growth and overpopulation play into the equation at all?
I would say, obviously, as population increases, we have more people who are interested in having energy at their disposal, and that's going to drive the demand for energy. And up until now, it's largely driven a demand for fossil energy. But that is not the main contributor. The main contributor is, especially in America, over the course of the last 30 years or so, there is an amazing acceleration in the use of energy on a per capita basis. So even if we had stayed flat in population, we still would have had rising greenhouse gases. You bring up an interesting point that there are lots of factors that contribute to climate change, more greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere. Population increase is one of them. The interest in Chinese wanting to have a middle-class lifestyle is one of them. In India is one of them. Farm use is one of them. But the main one that seems to have the clearest, the simplest, and the most transparent solution that we could do something about in relatively short order is this fixing of this market distortion and using that to drive our, we'll call it per capita emissions down. Thanks. Behind you, Sarah.
Right, when you calculate carbon price, taxing, is there any consideration to the cost, the ecological effects of like fracking, where you're polluting the water supply with hydraulic fluids? And is that factored in, or are you just talking about burning the energy? Because that's a big part of fossil fuels, is the extraction.
Sure.
Especially in fracking.
Yeah.
Which is insane in my opinion.
When we talk about this, because fracking imposes social costs as well. But the main argument that we advance for needing to act on this is the climate related.
Just the burning, not
just the burning.
Not the effects. So when you calculate carbon taxing,
yes,
how can I phrase this? The polluting effects of, let's say, fracking with hydraulic fluids going into the water supply, that's not a factor.
It's not a factor.
Okay.
We don't think about it, but on the other hand, we are not saying, and I'll get into this more, but we don't say, oh, let's run a model and figure out what the social cost of fossil fuel use is, both extraction and use.
Right.
We would never get that model right. It's too complicated, too many different effects, health effects. What exactly is the profile? As I said, we don't know how the ice sheets are going to melt. Okay, so you can't predict that. Okay, and what we will say is, we intend to run another experiment, just like we ran that experiment in 2008, and just like we've been running an experiment for the last 200 years. We're going to run another one, which is we're going to slowly raise the price of fossil energy until they no longer impose social costs on society. And the drilling and extraction, that could come into the conversation later. But I'll also say that I want to say, in this century, I hope that this concept of completely internalizing social costs for any activity begins to take root. Because there are a lot of practices in society that impose social costs that are not factored into regulation and whatnot. So if we start to understand, social costs, we need a fee, okay? We need to balance that. And if we want to expand the fee so that it actually takes the social cost of extraction into account, we can do that at some point. But let's get a first success, and I want to move on to another question. So Sarah.
Yeah, I was just wondering if health concerns are any part of your equation. Is that part of the social? Because there's definitely been an increase, for example, in asthma due to the burning of fossil fuels. So, does that get fed into it, or is it just the air pollution?
We did a study. We had a study done. And one of the results that was included in that study was how many premature deaths are going to be avoided because of the emission reductions. But again, we're not how much are we going to save because dengue fever isn't going to expand as far, or Zika? You could go on and on and on, right? We're never going to know. So therefore, what we need to do is put a steadily rising fee until we achieve a sustainable level of emissions. Any other questions about free markets and social costs. Okay, so what are we going to do? So I've already kind of given this away, right? We propose to put a gradually rising fee on fossil fuels to artificially increase the price of fossil energy, to inspire and motivate entrepreneurs and investors to go and develop the clean energy solutions that we need in order to reduce our emissions. As I said, we can't calculate what those social costs are, and we'll never be able to calculate what those social costs are. But we know that they are imposing major social costs, and we face major losses as we go forward if we don't get this under control. So what we propose is, we propose that the government impose a fee on fossil fuels at the source. So if you're a wildcatter and you're out there extracting oil from a well, when you bring that oil to the ground, and when you sell it to your refinery or wherever you're selling it, that transaction will have a fee applied to it. And the fee will be proportional to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that will be released when that fuel is burned. So for example, coal is a very greenhouse gas intensive fuel. It will have a higher per ton of coal price than oil will have. And oil will have a higher per unit cost than natural gas will have. So on a per energy unit, per BTU, or however you want to measure energy, you will find that the fee would be applied more heavily to coal than it would be to oil, and more heavily to oil than it would be to natural gas. We propose that the fee would start at what we call $15 per ton of CO2 emissions potential, and it would increase by $10 per year every year thereafter. So $15 in the first year, $25 in the second year, $35, and so on. Just to give you an idea of what that would mean in terms of inflation, a $15 per ton carbon tax, or price on greenhouse gas pollution, would raise the price of a gallon of gasoline by 15 cents. So 15 cents is a swing that we see in the price of gasoline all the time. And it's not something that, as the opponents might put it, is going to kill the economy, because we've dealt with 15 cents. We've dealt with $2 increase in the price of gasoline. So just adding 15 cents in a year isn't going to do anything. And even after 10 years, if we're only up to $100 a ton, that's still only $1 at the pump. And over the course of 10 years, that's about the period where the car fleet kind of changes over, and people could be buying more fuel-efficient cars. And so even as the price of gas continues to go up because of the fee, people are not being hit that hard in their pocketbooks. Also, the reason why we propose doing this on a gradual basis is because it takes time for the economy to respond. It takes time for investors to make decisions. It takes time for companies to build up capacity to be able to produce the solutions that are needed and the products that are needed in order to meet energy demand as we go forward. Now, the imposition of a $15 per ton fee, if you run that out over 20 years, in about year 20, at $200 per ton, the government would be taking in about $1.2 trillion in revenue. Now, the United States economy is about $18 trillion. So 1.2 trillion is a significant fraction of the American economy. And here, I agree with the critics who would say, you can't impose a carbon tax, you'll kill the economy. We would kill the economy if the government were simply hanging on to all of that money. But that's not what we propose. What we propose is taking all of that money and returning it to households equally. So if anybody's familiar with the Alaska Permanent Fund. In Alaska, the state sells the mineral rights for the fossil fuels in the state. And when the fossil fuel companies extract those minerals, those oil and gas, they have to pay a royalty fee to the state. So the state collects the royalty fee, and then once a year they send a check around to every Alaskan resident. And I think it's about $1,700 a year or something like that right now. It's been going down. This would be exactly the same thing on a national basis. We simply have the Treasury collect a fee from companies. Companies would apply this just like they would any other sales tax. They take the money, they report it to the Treasury. When they file their taxes, here's how much we collected. That goes into a special fund. And then periodically, perhaps once a month, Americans would get a check that would represent their share of the fee. All together, we call this policy carbon fee and dividend. So charge a carbon fee and send dividends back to people. As I said earlier, if we did this and the price of fossil energy started to go up, we would see that clean energy revolution that we need. I want to see if this thing. I guess it went into standby, so somebody pick a.
Got it now.
So we had, we wanted to know what would this policy do to the United States economy. So we went to a company that, again, I'm proud to say, actually started at UMass Amherst. And it started about 35 years ago. They're called Regional Economic Models, Inc. They're a consulting firm. They have economic models, and this is the business that they're in. They work for, so just under clients and research, public sector, 47 out of 50, they work with 47 out of 50 states. They work with federal agencies, they work with regional authorities, cities, universities, international groups. If you have a question about a policy and it's going to affect the economy, you go to REMI and you ask them, can you please model this policy and tell me what it looks like in the out years. So this was the design that they used. It's basically what I said, except they started at $10 per metric ton rather than 15. And also something I didn't mention, the border adjustment. Again, another critique that people will give about a carbon tax is, what do you do about international competition? Because companies in countries that don't have a carbon tax are going to be able to come in and undercut the pricing on domestic industry. And you don't want that to happen. It turns out that the World Trade Organization does permit countries to apply tariffs to goods coming in order to balance, level the playing field around environmental regulation. So if a country implements environmental regulations, it raises their domestic prices, you can, under World Trade Organization rules, apply tariffs at your border for that, to make that a fair competition. So REMI included that in their model. So it's going to kill the economy? I don't think so. It's going to create 2.8 million new jobs, above and beyond what the economy is going to do anyway. So this baseline right here of 0, that's basically what they did, was they said, if you just hold all regulations, existing regulations constant and project them out 20 years, what happens to the economy? It grows. It adds jobs. Then take this policy and overlay it with that projection, and now what happens? And so this is the delta for every year that they model. Okay, so I don't know what the job growth is by 2035 if you don't have carbon fee and dividend, but it's something. But it's 2.8 million more if you do implement this policy. Gross domestic product grows by an additional 70 to 80 billion dollars per year, above and beyond what we would get otherwise. So over 20 years, you could do the math, a big change, big additional boost to GDP. GDP by industry, you might not be, no, you can't read that. The top bar there is actually healthcare and social assistance. So 2.8 million new jobs, you might think, oh, that's probably all going into solar cells and windmills. Well, no, not really. It's going into the things that people actually have a need for right now. So there's a lot of pent-up demand for healthcare and social services right now. And when you start sending that dividend check back to households on an equal basis, people spend it where there's pent-up demand. And that's going to be healthcare. The next one is finance and insurance. And the third one there is the retail trade. So, so not necessarily what you would think out of the box, but again, this is...
Could you comment on the bottom part of that?
The bottom part, the bottom one is manufacturing. The one immediately above that is mining. The one above that is transportation and warehousing. So, yeah, transportation could take a hit, I suppose. People might not want to be moving things over such long distances because of the increased cost of transportation fuels. I don't know why there's the drop in manufacturing. I have to ask about that. Jobs by industry, again, healthcare and social assistance. Second is retail trade. Third is other services. Down the bottom, the one on the bottom is mining. The one immediately above that is utilities. So a small hit to utilities, but not very much. The third one above that is management of companies and enterprises. But again, you see that jobs by industry, there's a pretty widespread across. I'm looking for energy. The closest there is the utility industry.
How about manufacturing?
Manufacturing is about at that. It's actually a little bit positive in this one. So jobs through manufacturing is a boost. CO2 emissions. So after 10 years, CO2 emissions drop by 30%, and after 20 years, they drop by 50%. So I don't know of another policy that's being proposed that has anywhere near that potential. Mostly what people are talking about are things like 6%, 12%, something like that.
What was the Paris Accord amount that we had agreed to, that we volunteered?
Well, the Paris Accord was, I think it was something about 26%.
Yeah, it's just below 30.
Gary, don't put it in the past tense, it still is true.
Yes, it is, absolutely. That we volunteered.
Well, yes.
Great.
The monthly dividend, so this is a stunning number, I think, that this is monthly dividend per household of 4. And so in the first year of implementation, it would be just under $50 per month. And out at year 20, it would be close to $400 per month.
Per month.
Per month. So
$4,800
if you're a family of 4 and you're at the lower end of the income scale and you get $4,800 per year, that's a pretty good check to be getting. And this is why we call this a very fair policy, because actually one of the critiques that you'll hear about a carbon tax or raising fossil fuel prices or anything like that is that it's going to hurt poor households. Well, this policy doesn't hurt poor households, it helps them. 60% of households by income will break even or come out ahead because of this policy. So the 3 lowest quintiles of income groups in the United States, again, they break even or they come out ahead. And the 2 highest quintiles, the top 40%, they break even or they come out behind. But of course, they're in a better financial position to be able to make decisions and absorb some of these costs. Can I just get through this and then we'll take some questions? Real income per capita goes up by $700 per year in year 20. And this was the premature death slide. 225,000 avoided premature deaths over the course of 20 years. And this is because of the particulates and the other pollutants that fossil fuels put into the environment, not because of people who are going to die in future Hurricane Sandys or Hurricane Katrinas or Hurricane Irenes. If you look at the electricity bullet here, retirement of the coal fleet by the mid-2020s and replaced by wind, nuclear, solar, and geothermal. So, a couple of other facts about the policy and what the results will be. That a key thing is the electricity price. Electricity prices would peak in 2026, so that would be 10 years into the plan, and then they would start decreasing from there on out. And that is a reflection of the fact that, yes, it does take time to build up new infrastructure, to build up new manufacturing, to get these things into the market, but then at a certain point you reach these economies of scale where things start getting cheaper because you're able to do volume purchases, manufacturing processes get optimized and so on, and so you can start to see prices start to come down. And then also, over the course of 20 years, you might think with all of this energy inflation going on, we would see a high inflation number generally in the economy, but actually, over the course of 20 years, there's only a 2% cumulative increase in inflation across the whole economy. So even very modest inflation effects for this policy. So, we know that fossil fuels incur the social costs that we're all paying for, not at the pump, but as we go about our lives and as we suffer from the increased effects of extreme weather and pollution generally. The free market could respond and help us out of this and help to minimize the effects of future climate change. But in order for the free market to do that, it's got to have an economic incentive. It has to make economic sense for investors to take out their checkbooks and start trying to find the entrepreneur who's going to found the next clean energy Google or Apple or Tesla. And until we get the economics right, we're not going to see that type of investment happening. So there's one final section, which is about how are we actually going to get this policy passed. And I'll talk about that soon, but are there any questions about carbon fee and dividends? So before, there was one, yes, back here.
Yeah, the slide back there that shows the decrease in carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen slides like that, but then I recently ran across something, and I've forgotten just what the label was, but basically saying that those kinds of things are overly optimistic because people have to drive their cars, for example. They have to heat their home. And rising the price is only going to have a certain amount of effect on that.
So I look at that result and I say that's an underestimation. And the reason I say that is because, you know, what I like to say is that the clean energy solutions of today, the windmills that we see, the solar cells that we have, even the car I drive, a Prius, a hybrid. These, it's a little hard to imagine, but in my view, these are like what rotary phones are to the telecommunications revolution, okay? I mean, this is a phone today. And this came about because there was really unresistible consumer demand for a device that's this practical and this compact, okay? And that same demand is going to drive innovation like we can't imagine today. And the economy and our capabilities, the educated workforce that we have, the advancements in computers that we have. I mean, you know, Tesla came out with, not, is it Tesla? I guess he's probably calling it Tesla, or it's Tesla Energy or something. Roof shingles that are solar cells.
Yeah.
These kinds of innovations they're just unimaginable to us. And I get that question a lot about, very early on when I started doing this, I was talking with a friend over the phone, and she said, well, yeah, you know, prices for energy went up. People could take public transportation where it's available. Well, 10 years from now, we're not going to be dealing with public transportation like it is today. We're going to have public transportation that reaches out a little bit further because there's going to be greater demand for it. So those changes will come, and they'll come much more quickly than they've come in the past because, as we know, our engineering firms, our scientific firms, they've got this innovation thing down. And there's a lot of science out there in terms of battery technology and others that has not made its way into the market yet. So I really do think that this is an underestimation. And I mean, I wouldn't put a guess on it, but I'd be surprised if we were sitting at only 50% of reduction. Is it a quick follow-up?
Yeah, I would say that likewise, the implication about that question I asked on the manufacturing, likewise say that there probably would be more manufacturing going on to supply these kinds of new products.
Yeah, there's a dynamic there that has yet to play out. There's a book called Small, Gritty, and Green, which is, the subtitle is The Promise of America's Small Cities in a Carbon-Constrained Economy, in a carbon-constrained world. That as you raise the price of transportation, it's going to push the manufacturing and the creation of products closer to population centers than it is now. So again, these are dynamics that will just have to come out, but this study says we have the running room, we have the breathing room in order to allow this experiment to proceed.
My turn.
Okay, your turn.
There's a rising tide that's just going to crest on June 20th. It's a tide of lobbying for and against two bills which are in Boston's legislature.
We're going to talk about that.
Can you please compare and contrast your approach with theirs?
The Massachusetts plans?
Two plans, one from the House and one from the Senate.
Yeah.
So,
Massachusetts plan.
So the one in the Senate is a revenue neutral bill. It's a great bill. It returns as much money to households as households spend on energy, and it returns as much money to businesses, municipalities, and nonprofits as those organizations spend on energy. And so it's a very balanced way of taking care of making the bill revenue neutral, while also not disadvantaging in-state companies against out-of-state competition. In Massachusetts, you can't do a tariff against other states. So you have to find some other way of compensating Massachusetts industries for the rising energy prices that they're going to see in state. It's a completely revenue neutral bill. The other bill is, I believe it reserves 20% or so for investment in clean energy technologies. And I really can't, my only comment about that is that every dollar that you take and invest somewhere else makes the bill $1 more regressive. And the last thing I want to see us do is try to solve the climate problem on the backs of the poor. So the more revenue neutral the bill can be, without carve-outs or anything like that for other special purpose things, I think the better it is. And then not only that, you know, if Massachusetts were a country, we'd be the third wealthiest country per capita in the world, okay? If we need to invest state or public money in clean energy technology, we have the resources to do that. We don't need to do it on the backs of the poor. I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question about the dividend fee.
Yes.
I mean, the dividend did the study take into account the administrative costs to be sending those checks back every month? And-
Yes.
Yeah.
So that is going to be a cost. I believe that it's something like 3 cents on the dollar for the full tax that gets collected. So, yeah, that will be a cost. I don't think that this study took that into account. So those numbers would be reduced marginally. I should really, one more and then I should wrap up.
I just wanted to say that the House bill actually has a provision that gives more money to the lower income quintiles, so that the economic models show that it will protect even a higher percentage of low income.
Okay. Okay, so how are we actually going to get this done? So this is what I've been working on since 2010 or so. I joined Citizens Climate Lobby. We're a grassroots political organization. When I joined, we had 25 chapters. Today we have probably about 350 worldwide. We have volunteers in every congressional district in the United States. We have chapters in every state. It's a very grassroots organization in that most of the work of the organization is done by the grassroots volunteers. We are not a big national environmental organization that works at collecting money and sends that money to a national organization that spends it hiring people and having people go and lobby on our behalf. Instead, every Citizens Climate Lobby volunteer goes and lobbies for the Citizens Climate Lobby policy. We view the job of getting this legislation passed as consisting of pulling on sort of 5 levers. One of them is lobbying. Another one is working with the media. A third one is what we call grass tops lobbying, which is going out and talking with influential individuals in the community, educating them about this policy and getting them to sign letters of endorsement or coming with us to lobby for the bill. The fourth one is grassroots outreach, which is like this. I don't know, are there any influential individuals in here? There's one. I'll be talking with you after. And then the fifth one is development. And by that I mean whether it's expanding by starting new chapters or improving our own skills at being lobbyists. Our executive director likes to say that we are betting the ranch on relationships. And what he means by that is we're not out there calling people names and complaining about other things that they believe in or want to do or legislation they want to pass. We focus solely on this policy of carbon fee and dividend. And that's the only thing we want to be talking with our members of Congress about. In fact, we had a lobby team go in and meet with Eric Cantha. And the first thing they said to Eric Cantha, he was a representative from Virginia. First thing they said to him was, we don't want to see you leave Congress until you do something about the climate problem. Now, most environmental groups, when they walk in to Eric Cantha's office, they'll be saying things like, how could you, and why did you do that? And they'll be working on the outside to support whoever his opponent is so that they can get somebody friendlier for their cause. But at CCL, we like to say that you don't pass climate legislation with the Congress that you want, you pass it with the Congress that you have. And so that's why we have chapters in every state and chapters in well more than half of congressional districts. Because we want those constituents to be out building relationships with their members of Congress, explaining their concerns, answering their questions about the policy, and bringing them along the curve to get them to understand what we're asking for, and to do a couple of things. Sponsor our legislation, co-sponsor the legislation, and at least don't filibuster the legislation. Okay? So we work very hard at staying politically neutral. When we actually have our national conference coming up on June 11th through the 13th, we'll be in Washington on the 13th. We'll go to Capitol Hill. We will meet with over 500 offices on Capitol Hill. So that means we're meeting with almost all of the members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans. And our chapters are developing the types of relationships that I'm sure you like to have when you go into work or when you go into your volunteer activities, of meeting with people that you know and having conversations that go on over the course of years and don't just consist of somebody coming in, banging their fist on the table and saying, "We don't have any more time, we have to solve this problem today, why aren't you out there doing it?" Because that's not going to get you anywhere. So as I say, we educate ourselves, we have a very structured process, we have a monthly national conference call where we educate ourselves, we talk about accomplishments for the last month, and we talk about the focus of the upcoming month. So whether it's we want more people to write op-eds, we want more people to meet with their members of Congress and district, and chapters make their own decisions about what they want to work on. So this is very much a grassroots organization. Our executive director always says, the best ideas come from the field. And they do, the national organization does look at what happens in the field, and they take those results and then they flow them out nationally when they seem to be working for people. We've had some significant successes, and I hope that next week when I'm in Washington, I'll be able to get some feedback from the Democratic members of the Massachusetts delegation, because there's now a caucus in the House called the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is half Democrats and half Republicans. It's up to 42 members total, and they just submitted a bill with 10 co-sponsors, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats. It's called a Climate Solutions Commission. It would set up a commission that would make recommendations about what to do about climate change based on the best science. So the Climate Solutions Caucus has been meeting now for a year and a half. They actually lost several Republican members in the election, but within a month they were back up to full speed because other Republicans came in to fill the vacuum. There's a resolution, I call it the Gibson Resolution. It's a resolution in the House. Gibson was a representative from New York. He was a Republican, and he submitted this resolution that said climate change is real and the Congress ought to be doing something about it. And he's got, well, he's now out of Congress, but his replacement resubmitted the same resolution, and it now has 17 Republican co-sponsors. There was a group of Republican senior statesmen who went to Washington a couple of months back and established something called the Climate Leadership Council, and they proposed a policy that they called carbon dividends, which is essentially our plan. Again, giving all money back equally as dividends, not as corporate income tax reductions or anything like that, but giving money back to households. And they went and talked with the White House, and they are a voice on the conservative side, on the again, conservative Republicans pushing for that within the Republican conference. Even at CCL, we have an action team called the Conservative Caucus, which is made up of Republicans. So CCL members, our founders are Republicans. So we very much reach across the aisle, and we try to talk with people from all points of the political spectrum, because we think that this is not a liberal solution, this is not a conservative solution. This is just common sense, that we ought to have a fair market in our energy supply, and that the cost of all products and services ought to reflect true costs and not just partial costs of extraction while imposing a lot of social costs on everybody else. So I'll just wrap up. So we know that greenhouse gases impose social costs that we're already paying indirectly. The future social costs going out can be reduced if we can get emissions under control, and a gradually increasing fee on fossil energy with dividends returned to households on an equal basis would drive the clean energy changes that we need to reduce emissions. Imposing a fee can only be done by the government, but right now we lack the political will for doing that. So Citizens Climate Lobby is building that political will across the country, one congressional district at a time, and we've already seen some success in terms of bringing Republicans around to our message. Passing fair, simple, and transparent climate and energy legislation is hard, but addressing the environmental threats created by climate change is far harder. And I just want to say there's some Citizens Climate Lobby literature over there. You can pick up one of these cards, and it summarizes our policy and tells you how to find us on the web. And also, there's a stack of these constituent comment forms, and if you're interested in getting a message to your congressperson, if you could just fill this out and leave it for me. If you fill it out completely, I'll see that it gets delivered to your congressman a week from Tuesday on the 13th. So, thank you, and I'll take any other questions. Sarah?
Yeah, just, it's actually not a question, but it's very cogent what you're saying. I talked to Humison's offices this past week, and our climate bills are coming up, I believe, on the 20th. So he's not having office hours until sometime late in the summer. In Westfield, because of budget issues. But his man in the office said that they are keeping a tally of those people who call pro or against the different legislation going forward. And I put in that I supported both the Safe Communities Act and I wanted Humison to support the carbon pricing legislation. So it is important that those people for whom Humison is a representative, that you get your call in as soon as possible.
Okay.
Is that form on your website also? Yeah.
I couldn't tell you where to find it.
Okay. I don't know.
It is on my website, that's where I got it from, but I couldn't tell you how to find it. I don't know the name, so.
Sure.
Is it?
So I have a question. Citizens Climate Lobby focuses only on carbon pricing.
Yes.
And you've made a great case for it, and I'm totally behind carbon pricing, don't get me wrong. But my question is basically, for what reasons has Citizens Climate Lobby chosen to just focus on carbon pricing? I mean, there's, the Clean Power Plan is much more of a regulatory approach. There's a number of regulations which have made big impacts in the United States. There's cap and trade. There's a number of infrastructure issues that I'm not honestly totally sure will all respond to a carbon price. But is there something I'm missing? There's the other two things. I'm just trying to be clear. There's a lot of questions. There's also time. I've asked myself, is this either more politically viable for everybody in Congress, or do you believe that it can be implemented in a faster way than other solutions? But in any case, you guys have chosen to simply have a one message approach, and I'm trying to figure out why.
Well, the first reason is because when you're growing a new organization, apparently it helps to have a really tight focus. If CCL had taken on many different issues, they would have had a much bigger educational problem on their hands, and they would have had a much bigger debate problem on their hands. They would have had to be, we would have had to become fluid in a number of different issues and areas, and we'd have to have REMI studies on 10 different things instead of just one. And then not only that, but it was the assessment of the founders that of all of the solutions out there, this was the one that would have the biggest impact the soonest. And so therefore, they wanted to drive the organization off of that. And I want to say that the free market is a really, really powerful, it's like oxygen to us, okay? We don't really appreciate the power of the free market. And passing this legislation, making it fair, simple, and transparent, is really going to leverage what we have in terms of the free market to have the biggest impact and the biggest reduction in emissions, bar none. There are, and then also to be fair, there are other organizations that are out there working to protect the Clean Power Plan, working to protect the regulatory power of the EPA, and we think that's all good, but we can't get dragged into that and keep our focus and keep growing in the way that we want to.
So the group that went, the senior Republicans that went to the
Yeah.
White House,
Yeah.
there was some talk, the way I heard it was, okay, we're going to compromise by not having regulations, not having the Clean Power Plan, not having as many EPA regulations. Can you comment on that? Because I feel very conflicted about that.
I don't like that either. I don't believe that there's any reason for removing regulations that are never going to be called upon because the carbon price will take care of whatever problem they would otherwise be addressing. For me, it's not a starting point. I did have somebody, a legislative director from our organization, who said to me, when you're talking with Democrats, you might want to start the conversation about needing to roll back some regulatory laws. And I said, I'm not negotiating with myself here. Let's get everybody on board with a carbon price, and let's see what happens in the legislative process. And if it gets into the sausage making, vote trading, something or other, then somebody will have to make a decision, at that point in time. But today, we have one policy and one policy only that we're pushing, and we actually have a set of principles, and one of those principles is retention of all existing regulatory power.
As you know, there's several bills, as someone already mentioned, in process here in Massachusetts. And in talking with people, what's the main objection you find that people have about a carbon fee bill? And how can we answer it in, you have 5 minutes or something like that?
Yeah.
I don't know that there's one objection that people have. I think that you just have to do this. You just have to get out and explain it to people. Just to come back to something I said earlier, I'm a little, I once said to somebody, the reason why somebody came to me and they said, my friend doesn't think that a carbon tax is a good idea. And I said, that's because they haven't spoken with me. So, it's so obvious. It's so clear. To me, when I think about social costs and any organization or company or industry that is able to foist its costs onto any community, that's just wrong. And I think most people understand that. And I think that a lot of people, it's very hard to imagine this country living at the same lifestyle level as we do without fossil fuels, because again, fossil fuels are like oxygen in a sense, right? is so ubiquitous. They're always available. They're cheap. And so it's hard to imagine a life without that. But we just have to sort of face up to that fear and recognize that it's a little bit irrational, because we see companies like Tesla and the big windmill, the big power companies that are now putting up windmills all over Europe, and solar cell companies and car companies building more efficient cars. And we have the know-how. We know how to do this. We can do this. But the market is wrong. And as long as we keep saying we want low energy prices, then we're not going to get to the market conditions that we need to drive the industries that we need to have this happen.
Gary, can I make before you make more questions, can I make a pitch for CCL? Gary has said this, but it makes sense with an organization that's a basically voluntary organization that's nonpartisan. We make donations to support them. When someone like Gary comes all the way across the state, we put out a basket. We ask you, if at all possible, before you leave, to make a donation to CCL as a way of thanking Gary for coming out tonight and sharing with us his knowledge and his expertise. We also, before you go, we have one of our members who's very active in following the legislation here in the state. They just wanting to share with you some information at the local and the state level that may be of interest to you because you have been here tonight. We can do that at the end of the question period. We can do it now. It's really your call.
Why don't you do that now, and I'm going to stay and answer questions.
Okay, well, Deborah, why don't you come up and share your brief comments with the group?
Okay. Basically, I just want to address the fact that we all can do something toward this change. We heard a little bit about the carbon fee and rebate and what it'll do and how effective a solution it is. And we know the ways it'll help our state and our country. But I think we're really in a good place living in Massachusetts because we're very fortunate. In our state, we have two legislators who are already forward-thinking. They already came up with two bills that are in the State House, have been in the State House for a while, and they're working hard to get those through. There's a coalition called the Massachusetts Coalition for Clean Energy Future, and it's a coalition of many groups in the state, and they have been working together also with that same end goal of getting those bills passed. We have other groups within Massachusetts that are working hard to support that coalition's efforts. We have the Climate Action Now group, there's Climate Exchange, and there's many others. As you go online, you'll find lots of groups. So we can work with all those groups working together on these issues. The two bills that are in the Massachusetts legislature right now, we have some copies of the bills. They are available that you can pick up and take home and read. And it's the H-1726 bill, that's the Benson bill, and in the Senate it's 1821, the Barrett bill. So you can read a little more about them. You can also find them online, or you can go to the Mass Legislative Government site, and we have the email address or the online address for that we can give you. The individual actions you can take is to support what these groups are trying to do. The Mass Coalition has come up with a great idea. On June 13th, just a few days away, they're going to be having a carbon lobby day at the State House. And it's going to be a wonderful event that gives both people who are more proficient at lobbying and those that are new to it a chance to go to the State House, get acquainted with other like-minded individuals who are also concerned about the lobbying for carbon pricing, and also get a chance to have a conversation with your particular legislative people. So you can meet with your state senator, your state rep. And there is a process of how to set that up. But it's going to be on June 13th from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. And We are trying to coordinate people from this area that would like to go to that, and so I'm going to have a contact sheet at the table that you can sign up, and I can get back to you on details and tell you what steps you need to take. We're going to try to arrange the carpool to make it easier for people to get there. Some of us have already been to the State House, so we knew a little bit about where to go, how to park, how to get there, where to find food when you're there, that kind of thing. And we'll talk more about the logistics. The other really good thing that this group did, and actually the local CAN group is working on, is getting people prepared to go to that 6/13 event. So they're having a carbon summit. Now, originally there was one scheduled for Newton on June 10th, and that is still in effect, but they decided to have a local one that might be easier for local people to get to, and that's going to be on June 8th at the Jones Library in Amherst, I believe at 1 o'clock. So we have flyers on the table. I'm going to tell you a little briefly about a few other things, and then I'm going to ask Mary Jo, who is a representative from the Climate Action Network and has been involved in this a great deal, and is specifically involved with creating and getting this local summit going, to share any information she has about it. But the other thing I want to tell you is that even if you can't go to one event, or you can only go to one and not the other, it's imperative that we all try in whatever way we can to support these legislative things that are happening, because these bills, which have been in the State House for a while, are actually coming up for hearing on June 20th, which is going to be another big, significant day where we want people to show up at the State House. And Mary Jo will probably talk a little about that as well. But I think it's important that we just realize now is the time to act on these things. And even if you can't go there, there are ways you can act. We have some postcards here that are addressed to Governor Baker. Oh, yeah. So yes, you can call. That's one way to reach your legislators. And you can also send the postcard. Actually, you don't even have to send it. We have postcards here. If you simply fill in the places you need to fill in and sign it, we will personally take it to the State House for you on 6/13 when we all go. I also have some petitions that I created on the table. So if you see the name of your representative or state senator, you can sign underneath, and basically what you're just signing, acknowledging that you are in support of the 2 carbon pricing bills and you would like to see them passed. That way, if we can't bring your physical body there, I can at least bring your name and show them with some numbers that we have people interested in these measures. And of course, you can write your legislators on your own. I can tell you the addresses of some of them. If I don't know them, I can take your name and number and get back to you, or I can tell you where you can find that information so you can write to them as well. Any of the educational materials we have on the table, you're free to take. We have limited numbers. We hope you'll enjoy them, and we hope when you're done with them, you'll share them with somebody else so we can get the most bang for our buck on those. Our group, Voices Rising Together, will be holding more events in the future to try to educate ourselves and everyone else along with us on these issues. We hope to have more speakers, perhaps some documentary movies that will show, and other things to help us all learn, so we're an educated group of people working toward legislative ends that will work for us. So please check our Facebook page. Please check if you're on our newsletter list. If you're not, please check. There's a sign-up sheet. We wanted you to sign in coming in today for 2 reasons. Number 1, to get a head count, and number 2, to have information to contact you, particularly if you're interested in being involved with our activities and we don't know how to reach you yet. So please fill that out. And lastly, I just want to thank you all for coming today. And personally myself, I want to thank you all for, like me, caring about this planet that we all must share and we all must have in good condition to survive. For that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm sorry, let me introduce Mary Jo now, and she'll take up with more details that she knows from her group then.
Good to see you. Yes, so I want to be brief, but we have probably the most important couple weeks coming up in carbon pricing. Our governor has moved to keep Massachusetts in the Paris Accord,
And we really feel that he will move for carbon pricing if we show up. So to get yourself educated, we're actually bringing people from Eastern Mass to come out for a summit on lobbying, learning about the bills, and that's going to be next Thursday, June 8th at Amherst. And if you sign up over here, we'll get you more information. There's also a flyer on that. And so for June 13th, Lobby Day, we are working to get all of the Western Mass reps. And we do not have meetings set up or constituents yet with Vallis, with Humison, with our reps in Hampden County. So we really need, if you're from one of those areas, we really need, Deanne and I really need to talk to you about making that happen with those reps and possibly coming to Lobby Day on June 13th. But the biggest thing that we need, the biggest turnout for, is June 20th. All of this is compacted into three crazy weeks, but June 20th is a hearing at the State House on these bills. And you don't have to really know the details. We really need just a large amount of people. We have better ways to get to Boston to make it less scary and so it can actually be fun. So please sign up over here, and then we have flyers on these 3 different events. And if you're from one of those districts, please let me know. Thank you very much.
I already have a meeting set up with Vallis. So, but I need people from his district to go. So if you're from his district, please see us, and I'll tell you about the meeting.
I'm sorry, Vallis.
Vila. Oh, okay.
Please don't call him Vallis.
Let's turn it back to Dr. Rucinski and see if there are other questions that the audience has for Dr. Rucinski.
Why don't we just take it over to the food table? Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all, everybody.